Hello and welcome back to Season 14, Episode 28 of the Ubuntu Podcast. Hopefully you've all finished crying into your hankies because today we are going to bringing you some command line love and some listener feedback, and we're going to take a look back at how Ubuntu has evolved while the Ubuntu Podcast has been talking about it. And joining me this week are, of course, Mark.
Hello, I'm still here. I've not gone yet.
You're still here. You haven't given up yet. Alan, are you here?
Not long now.
Welcome back, both of you. So, what have you been doing in the last, I don't know, how long is it? A week? A week since we last spoke, Mark. What have you been up to?
I have been using Windows Terminal.
Oh, Windows Podcast, here we come.
I can hear people unsubscribing right now.
No need. I use that there Windows at work, and in the dim and distant past, you had cmd.exe, which was the Windows command line, which was completely rubbish. And more recently, they have PowerShell, which is a better shell, but the terminal emulator it runs in is still not brilliant. And there are other third-party shells and third-party terminal emulators available. But recently, Microsoft decided to make their own decent terminal emulator called Windows Terminal. And one of the reasons that I got particularly excited about it this week was because I discovered that they've built Quake mode into Windows Terminal.
Is this so that you can have a drop-down terminal from the top? Exactly.
So it's similar to Linux apps like Tilda or Quake or Yaquake, which wrap GNOME terminal or console in a wrapper, which lets you summon it with a key press, and then it drops down from the top of your screen, and then you press the key again, and it folds up, and it's always there running in the background. But rather than having to have a separate app wrapping Windows Terminal, they've just decided to build it into Windows Terminal, which I thought was very cool.
Nice.
Yeah, I have to say, Microsoft have been very canny in sort of hooking into... There's a few features of the Linux desktop that are genuine productivity boons. And, you know, workspaces is one, definitely pull down terminals is another. And I think Microsoft have done a very good job of sort of, you know, hooking into those things that are genuinely useful that I'm not going to say pioneered, but have been maybe popularized by desktop Linux and bringing that to Windows.
One of the things that I think is quite cool about the way they've done it here as well is this is a feature which I would say is kind of half done. Like it's there, but it's a bit hacky to get it working, and some of the features aren't very slick. But they've put it in anyway in a release. It's not in a developer preview. They're willing to, you know, put in early versions of features in a release product and then iterate on it. And I think they know that the audience it aimed at will probably be forgiving of that. And it's all in the open. There's a GitHub page with a big list of tasks for adding this feature and which release they're going to go into. And it's quite cool.
Yeah, Microsoft have good experience in running a massively popular open source project. You just need to look at how they've iterated with Visual Studio Code over the years and done a similar thing. I'm sure this will go from strength to strength. Alan, what have you been up to?
Inspired by Mark and his remote Steam machine in another room, I've done the same kind of thing. I had a, in inverted commas, spare PC. It's a desktop that I had with the GPU, and it's got Steam on it. And when Sam's friends came over, when they used to come over for the event, his mates would play on this PC, and it was good enough for, you know, the games that they wanted to play, so they could play 2-player across 2 rooms.
Oh, right.
Well, friends don't come round anymore, and so I've commandeered the PC and stuck it under my desk, and I've made it auto log in and Steam auto starts, and it has all my good games on it, and it's paired with the Steam link, which is downstairs in the lounge. So now, whenever I want to play a game, there's always a Steam machine somewhere on the network that can be very quickly powered on, and then I can just go and sit in the lounge and play with it. I haven't done any Wake on LAN or anything like that. I'll just turn it on.
Oh, amateur.
Well, I mean, I could for sure, but I don't think I need to, because it's not like it's a schlep to come upstairs and press a power button, or get one of my children to come up here and press the button for me.
Yeah.
They can do it, and then I'll sit in the lounge with a Steam Link.
Yes. One thing that I've been thinking about with the Steam Deck is using that to replace the Steam Link as the sort of front end for streaming from my big gaming PC, particularly because one of the sort of hands-on videos I saw was with Linus Tech Tips on YouTube, and he used it to drive a 4K monitor just for running a desktop, but the Steam Link only goes up to 1080p and my TV is 4K, so I'm wondering if I could use the Steam Deck to do 4K game streaming to my telly.
Ooh, interesting idea. Right, well, before we move on, if you haven't heard the shocking news, the Ubuntu podcast is coming to an end. The last episode will be on September the 30th. If you didn't hear the last episode, we talk about it then. So go and listen to that to inform yourselves as to why it's ending and how it's going to end. Those of you that have been supporting us on Patreon and PayPal, if you are feeling generous, please do keep your support up so that we can continue to pay Joe Ressington for his fine production services up until our final episode on September the 30th. But with that, let's move on to the rest of the show. Right, well, we thought we'd have a little bit of a retrospective. Some of us here have been talking about Ubuntu for far too long. But how long is it, Alan, that you've been doing the Ubuntu podcast and covering all things Ubuntu?
Well, this is season, 14?
Right.
So that long. The first season was season 1. So, yeah, a long time.
You didn't start on season 0?
No, we weren't that nerdy. But we did. I mean, it makes for counting nice and easy. So yeah, 13, nearly 14 years.
Right. So, and Ubuntu has been around how many years now? It's what?
Since 2004.
Yeah.
So a few years before that.
Couple of years before. Yeah. Okay. 4 years before that. And Mark, how long have you been covering Ubuntu here on this here podcast?
I think I joined sometime towards the end of season 2. So 12 years, maybe.
12 years. Right. Yeah. I'm just a slacker. So in that time, Ubuntu has changed a lot. There's been a lot going on in Ubuntu since 2008 when this podcast was first aired. I think that was when the first episode went out, wasn't it?
Simple maths, 2021 minus 14. Yeah, something like that.
So we've each picked some sort of, landmarks in sort of, Ubuntu's history. So Alan, where would you like to start in some of your sort of memories of what's been going on in Ubuntu over that time?
I think the first interaction I had, or the first in-person interaction I had with a lot of Ubuntu developers was at UDS. And the very first UDS, Ubuntu Developer Summit, I went to was in Seville in Spain. And I wasn't sponsored to go there. At the time I was a contractor and I took a week off work. So I was not being paid for that week. And I paid for my own way to fly out there and stay in a rather expensive hotel in Seville, because I wanted to be part of this thing. And, it was great. I got to see Jono there and, went out for beers with Jono and a load of other people. And I really felt taken under the wing, by Jono. And, he, took me along to some of the internal Canonical things and, got involved in some of the meetings and discussions that I had there. And it was quite revolutionary having those developer summits. So I think that was one of the key things I miss from the past, Ubuntu of the past, was those developer summits, I think. And it was instrumental in getting me involved in and keeping me involved in Ubuntu.
Interesting. So I never went to a UDS. At the time when UDSs were happening, there was more things going on in my life. Mark, did you ever participate in a UDS?
I didn't, I'm afraid.
Right. So the only UDS, and this was by a poor facsimile, was the online UDS, or that happened sometime after the physical events kind of shuttered.
they were rubbish compared to the real thing.
I think they were universally recognised as being a poor facsimile of the in-person event.
Yes.
Nevertheless, it was where I got to meet people from Canonical and in the community for the first time in air quotes face to face.
What about you, Mark? What standout things can you think about?
Well, my first Ubuntu memory was in fact Kubuntu, because in my early days I was always a KDE user. So when I started looking at installing Ubuntu, I found there was a KDE version and it was using GNOME, and I thought, well, KDE is obviously the one for me. So I installed Kubuntu Breezy Badger, I'm going to say, on probably my parents' desktop on a spare hard drive, I expect. So yeah, when I started the Ubuntu podcast, I was the KDE weirdo in the corner.
Yes, you were.
And now look.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think KDE and Ubuntu have gone from strength to strength. There was a bit of a bleak period when they transitioned from KDE 3 to KDE 4. That was hard. But they've certainly come out of that way better with KDE 5 and beyond.
For some considerable period, an effort was sort of funded by Canonical to sort of pay to maintain and develop Ubuntu, right? It was sort of a second distro in an official sense.
There was a hired employee who worked on all the Ubuntu stuff. Yeah, sure. Jonathan Riddell worked at Canonical for a long while. Yeah. And I think it was the first of, well, is it? I think
there was Edge Ubuntu as well.
Edge Ubuntu was probably one of the first ones on server. Anyway, yeah, Ubuntu's good. What about you, Martin?
Well, in a similar vein, it's going to be one of the flavors, right? So
I wonder which one.
Well,
shocker, XFCE.
Ubuntu Christian Edition.
It was. That was where I started. Yeah. No, so I was an Ubuntu user right from Warty Warthog. And then around that 2011, 2012 period, which I think we're going to touch on a bit later, I got a bit disenfranchised and I went to Arch Linux.
By the way,
I was an Arch Linux developer, by the way. I don't know if I've mentioned that.
Yes.
But ultimately, my sort of Ubuntu story starts proper in Alan's kitchen in July of 2014, where the proto Ubuntu Mate was created one afternoon when we both took the day off work.
Yeah. The ISO was originally called Matey.iso, wasn't it?
That was you.
What, like the bubble bar?
That was you. Yeah. It was called Matey, yes.
Was this before or after we interviewed you on the podcast?
It was just after.
This was afterwards, very soon afterwards. So yeah, if you go back looking in the episodes, I was interviewed on the Ubuntu podcast just about the Mate desktop. And at that time, I was an Arch developer, by the way. And, I was asked all sorts of awkward questions about, working on this, antique, desktop environment. And towards the end of that interview, I sort of said, well, the problem is that, Mate's kind of busted in Ubuntu. So, you can't really do anything useful with it. And I think Alan was probably a little bit affronted at this statement, this sort of, assertion. And a couple of weeks go by. And I get an email from Alan, and the subject of the email is "ha," and all that was in the email was a link to https://matey.iso, which I download and boot, and it was an Ubuntu-based OS running the Mate desktop by hook or by crook, and I thought to myself, okay, he's got my attention.
If we're going to talk about desktops, I think I have to mention Unity, because that when that first came out, it had a troubled start. I think it was released a little bit too early, but that's a thing with Canonical releasing things just a touch before they're ready. But I loved Unity, and once it got to like 2010, 2012, those releases, it was rock solid and super stable and fast. And there were optimizations added so that when you're playing games, the frame rate didn't get eaten by the desktop. There was work actually done by Daniel Van Boot, who still works on the desktop team on performance for GNOME Shell. He did a ton of work in Unity to make sure that full screen game windows were running really performant. And Unity was great. It got out of the way, and, performed well. And I loved the dash and the HUD and locally integrated menus and all the different things and the buttons on the other side. I loved it all.
In fact, Unity stopped me being the KDE weirdo in the corner. I actually moved from Ubuntu to Unity. Once it got to the stage, I think it was the HUD. Once I saw that and I used it a few times, I thought, this is it. This is what I want.
Yeah, and as we touched on earlier, it was actually that early introduction of Unity when it was a little bit rough around the edges that actually pushed me away from Ubuntu and discovered Mate Desktop, which has now been a hobby project for many years.
I do feel a little bit sad about a Unity, that it didn't ever get fully fleshed out, fully completed. It was never allowed to be on loads of other distros. It was never really packaged for all the other, Linux distributions. And all the design work that the design team in London did, there was tons of work done. And a lot of it never got finished because the engineers just didn't have time to finish all that work. And there was so much in there that, some of it you even see now in other desktops or in other operating systems that was designed back in 2010, 2012.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And maybe it's something that, people might not fully observe from the outside looking in. And I certainly didn't have an appreciation for until I joined Canonical. And there are reams and reams of unimplemented design documentation for Unity that went, many cycles into the future, that were well thought out user interface design that will never see the light of day. And it is sad because some of those features of Unity do live on now, like the indicators and the Ayatana project, that has been picked up by Debian developers. It lives on as, Ayatana on GitHub. It's been forked. It's being actively maintained. And in fact, there are 2 people who are being funded through UB ports in order to keep that project maintained and sustainable, because not only is it being used by classic desktops like Ubuntu Mate and XFCE, but it's being used by Lemuri, it's called now, but what was Unity 8, Ubuntu Touch. So a lot of that work does live on.
Well, before we had Unity, we had Ubuntu Netbook Edition. So I was a big fan of the EPC netbooks, small laptops. I think I liked the EPC because they were 9 inches. They were just smaller than the Dells were like 10 inches, and they were, they're not quite small enough to have that extra advantage. But the way the EPCs are built, the screens was still a big enough resolution. Didn't have too much bezel.
I think you're thinking with rose-tinted spectacles. They had humongous bezels. Those things.
No, I mean no. So the first EPC, where it had the speakers down the side and a tiny little screen, like the Windows 3.1 laptop my dad used to bring home from work, which had this tiny little screen in the middle of a massive lid. But no, the later models, the 901 sort of series ones, they were much neater. I mean, by today's standards, okay, I take your point, but the Netbook Edition interface did something which I still do today, which is have your applications be full screen. You have one at a time application on your screen and you switch between them with little tabs at the top, which is how I've got KDE configured to look right now without even thinking about it. That's why I do it that way. And I loved it. I was really sad when the Netbook Edition went away and or changed to the point it wasn't quite like that and then became Unity.
Yeah. So it's interesting. That's another bit of technology that lives on in Ubuntu Mate. So what you're just describing, that sort of single spatial application, it was Maximus that made that possible. And that lives on in Ubuntu Mate, and in amongst the layouts that you can choose to drive the operating system is a netbook layout, which enables that capability to it doesn't have that. What I liked about the netbook remix was how the desktop was used as like your application picker and your launcher and everything. I thought that was a really good use of that bit of space that broadly is either unused or just full of clutter. I really liked it. I think following on from the netbooks, because those were the first devices where Ubuntu shipped like on devices from tier 1 OEMs. And I think that sort of set a path for the likes of Dell and Lenovo and Hewlett-Packard to ship Ubuntu on devices that were sold initially to sort of, enterprises and organizations, but also finally the general public.
Yeah, I remember a comment from someone in the organization, something along the lines of GNOME 2 just didn't shift machines for companies like Dell and Lenovo, whereas Unity did. And that, that's another thing that makes me, quite proud of Unity is Dell and Lenovo. There's the timing of the deals that they got, but having a desktop that looked nice was a significant part of getting that deal with those vendors to get them to ship with Ubuntu pre-installed with Unity on it was pretty pivotal.
While those early versions of Unity were not for me, I think it's more than just looking nice, because it didn't just look nice, but it did have new thinking in terms of the way you interact with a desktop computer. And that must have resonated with, the tier 1 OEMs who were looking for something to sell devices.
And they certainly sold enough of them that they carried on selling them.
To this day. Well, I think it's over 12 years. I think they've been doing this now.
Yeah. And another thing that came out of this was, I think it was Dell who developed DKMS, the dynamic kernel module system. So this was where, if you've got hardware which needs a kernel module that's not, a driver that's not part of the kernel that you're getting, it will rebuild it every time you update the kernel without you having to faff around and do it yourself. And that makes a huge difference when you've got, odd pieces of hardware. I mean, I'm using it right now with my webcam so that I can use my phone as a webcam. It needs a kernel module to do that. And it uses DKMS to build it, which means that every time I upgrade the kernel, my webcam doesn't break, which is nice.
Yeah, bonus.
Now, in addition to Unity and all of the innovations there was the diversion into mobile operating systems.
Yeah, I have a fondness for Ubuntu Touch because when I first started at the company, I was sworn to secrecy back in whenever it was, 2011, I think, November 2011. Sworn to secrecy that they were going to make a phone or a phone operating system. And obviously I couldn't talk to anyone about it. And when we started waving prototypes around in the office, they were very secret and, they were prototypes. They were mock-ups. They were cardboard cutouts, as some people call them. And even when we went to CES and other trade shows, some of them were barely working, very well scripted. But we got from there to an operating system that shipped on devices that people could actually buy online. And that was hard work. And it built a community of people who were building apps in QML and web languages. And some people created all kinds of wacky things for the Ubuntu phone. And I really enjoyed that time. It was a diversion, and maybe we should have stuck on working more on Ubuntu desktop and not being diverted. But, it's Mark's company. If he wants to chase one of these dreams, and it's his money, then why not, give it a go. But while it didn't pan out and it wasn't the resounding success that we, maybe dreamed it might be, it was still good fun, and some software came out of that people are still using today.
Yeah, I mean, it was a moonshoot, and as you say, Ubuntu Touch does live on at Ubuntu ports, and it also paved the way because clicks were the packaging mechanism for Ubuntu Touch, which were the inspiration for snaps. And as everybody knows, we can agree that there's been zero controversy around snaps. They've been a glorious success, and every Linux user absolutely loves them.
Yes.
So with that, we can wrap up, 14 years of Ubuntu evolution. What did we miss? What are your standout memories from Ubuntu over that period that we didn't talk about? You can send us your feedback to show@ubuntupodcast.org. And now it's time for some command line love. And this command line love just says bash web server.
What?
And I know this wasn't submitted by me. So who's on my lawn?
So this was me. I read about a version of this in Linux magazine, where you can use the netcat command to basically listen on a port, and then when you get a request on that port, you can send back something, and that something can be a valid HTTP response, which means that you're effectively running a very basic web server. But what you can do with that web server is things like outputting a file or outputting a bash command. And combining that with a Python module called ANSI2HTML, if that bash command happens to use formatting in your terminal, you can replicate that same formatting in a web page. So the example that I've got in the show notes runs top. It doesn't run it continuously. It just does a one-shot run of top. So it'll run each time you request from your whatever address you set this up on, it'll run top, and then it'll convert that to HTML, and you'll get a black page with the top output and all the right stuff in bold and it nicely aligned in columns. You get a few ANSI artifacts, but yeah, I thought this was quite cool.
Wow.
Man, I tell you what are people going to do when we're not on the air anymore? And also, Tim Berners-Lee, eat your heart out. This is what the web should have been.
This looks 100% secure and nothing could possibly go wrong.
You will find the full mega janky while loop implemented in Bash in our show notes. Thank you, Mark. That warms the cockles of my heart that you can do web servers in Bash. Gonna write totally an Apache rewrite in Bash now. Right, with that, let's move on. And now it is time for all your wonderful feedback. Roger Light emailed us at show@ubuntupodcast.org.
I'm feeling a bit inadequate after the feedback on the last show. We've only printed out 2,083 pages on our colour laser printer.
Oh dear.
Did we look up how many pages we'd printed or something?
Not us. Somebody else was pointing out the efficacy of their laser printer.
Right.
And they knew precisely that it was 5,000 and something pages per toner cartridge or something. Never mind, Roger. We're all feeling a little bit inadequate these days, but thank you for sharing your printer output with us. Torrin Doyle posted a comment on our website.
I just listened to season 14, episode 26, and you read out my comment saying the code was posted incorrectly and was fixed. It works fine now. Thanks.
You are welcome. I'm glad that worked for you, Torrin. And finally, Kyle Williams left a comment on our YouTube channel. youtube.com/Ubuntu podcast.
Funnily enough, hyperlinks have been supported in the Serenity OS terminal for quite a while, and a link to a video. Now, this is after our super interview with Andreas about Serenity OS. And then afterwards, I made a flippant comment when we were talking in some... was it feedback or something?
It was a command line love.
It was the command
Mark
line
had
love.
a command line love.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I made a flippant comment that this particular feature wouldn't be in the Serenity OS terminal. Turns out Alan was wrong.
I should point out that whilst we were doing that, this is behind the curtain for listeners. We were recording that segment and Andreas was still with us. He was in, our room with us. And whilst Alan was, pontificating as to whether or not this was the thing, I could see Andreas, nodding enthusiastically that this was definitely a supported feature.
Oh, well. It gave us some feedback. Thanks very much, Kyle, on YouTube.
Thank you, Kyle. And let's move on. Right, that's it for episode 28. Only 2 more episodes to go. You won't be hearing one of these at Christmas. We're ending the Ubuntu podcast because we're awful, awful nerds. Thank you all very much for listening, and we look forward to speaking to you next time.